Well, Nikki, first of all, thanks for putting this together. Thanks for everybody for enjoying this from the comfort of their home. Um, it's fun to wear sweatshorts and dress up like a Miami used car salesman right now. But hopefully I'll give you a little bit of fun info in the next 25 minutes. We'll learn a few things. If you were expecting slides, there are no slides. If you know me, you knew there wouldn't be slides because I'm a lazy human being. And more so, I wanted to just kind of give you a little bit of a kind of a lay of the land of how I view social, how it operates in other functions of a business, both from the individual level and from the company level. Because I know that people watching, some will be entrepreneurially focused, some will be doing this for a business. So we're all going to be working in different things when the apocalypse ends. So what I wanted to kind of get into first is, if there's any word that I want you to think about, or a takeaway, or a mental slide to take home, it's the word leverage. How I've always viewed social is creating leverage. A quick background on myself. I was doing marketing for United Way 10 years ago. Figured that if I wanted to get half a client, I could make as much as I was making at United Way. And I thought, well, that's probably a pretty easy proposition, right? There's always there's stress in everything, right? It's the stress that you're willing to handle and want to handle. So when I was building my own business, the first thing I thought about was building leverage on social. So I work in PR and comms. I do a lot there, and realized, okay, if the general tone, tenor, what people are doing in this industry is the press release, and I did this as a 23-year-old account exec, where I would blast emails to people and say, hi, person I don't know, out of the goodness of your heart, would you like to write this article in the New York Times? Well, obviously that's probably not going to always happen. So I knew the first thing out of the gate I needed to do was create more leverage. And we'll get to how that relates to both individual and corporate side. But the general concept is this. A lot of people on the individual level get into social because they want to be an influencer, or they want to, they look at that direct relationship, right? And I say, look at it a little bit broader, right? There are so many different points of influence that you can create. There are so many different ways to kind of map that out and spread. We'll get into that. But I knew I needed to create leverage. So when I created leverage, I built up a social platform. Mine, I kind of focused on Twitter. If it had been 10 years ago, I would have focused on TikTok. Or now I would have focused on TikTok. You don't have to spread yourself too thin. But for me specifically, because I worked in comms and I knew that's where journalists hung out, that's where I wanted to create the most leverage. And that's always kind of like the assessment that you make before you get into anything, is kind of go where your audience is, right? So, I mean, if your audience is doing TikTok dances, definitely go there. As I did this and built up a little bit more leverage, it became a little easier for me to go to talk to a writer or talk to somebody to kind of place something for a client. Over time, this is kind of how then I would start writing for smaller publications, and I'd build that up into bigger publications. And eventually I kind of worked my way into both sides of the world. So again, I both understood what the pitches were out there from competitive clients or competitive agencies, but I was also able to kind of identify how I would want to approach this with my clients and what was working, what wasn't working. But also I would fully understand how I wanted to navigate the system. I've never really focused much. So my social has always been a little bit of a joke, a little bit of my personality, because that's just where I tend to lead, right? It's very rare that I'll be on here talking about actually smart things, because I just knew the better way to engage, the better way to get the audience was that. So, hence the coffee mug, which, by the way, not like a typical morning news show. This actually does have coffee in it, and I'm going to need it. Oh, that's delicious. Okay. Toasted Graham by Starbucks, by the way, if anyone's wondering. So as I built this leverage, it was funny, like I would get one publication that would come to me, another publication, because I had an audience, right? And having this audience allows you some flexibility. And I'll pause for a second and say, in a time of massive uncertainty in everybody's professional career, because this virus is going to touch all points of contact, right? I just saw the announcement with Ford and GM and Chrysler suspending until March 30th. Every supply chain is going to be affected. Every industry is going to be affected. I work from home with these two adorable llamas or alpacas behind me. I can't see them, but still that's going to be affected. And the more diversified you are, the more leverage you have, the more things you're doing, the better that scenario might work out. So as I started to look at the landscape, I saw a bunch of really good speakers doing their thing there. So I didn't gravitate there. I saw a lot of good people on social doing, webinars and workshops, and that wasn't working for me. I did a tweet chat for a little bit, which was fun and it was engaging. But I, over time, started to realize that the point of why I got into social wasn't because I'm a massive extrovert, although it is. It was because I wanted to create the leverage. And once I had the leverage, well, then it just kind of started to, kind of be on autopilot, and I wasn't seeking any more validation. Although, let's be honest, kind of always doing that. But as I built this leverage, I started to realize that there was a gap even inside the influencer community. This is why I started working with companies like Adobe and Oracle and, a bunch of really cool companies where we'd have the conversation about how can we build out an influencer network. And the first conversations were more so, I came at from this approach. As an influencer, I would probably be okay with getting paid 5, 10, 20K, whatever it is to be there, but I'd much rather have the introduction to the other big client, right? That's going to make me more money. So when you understand that motivation, right, then, and that's my own internal motivation, not everybody's wired, but most are, right? And generally speaking, a lot of companies, including your own, and a lot of big companies have the leverage to give you that relationship or elevate you on some scale. So if we're talking about any mid to big size company, right, your influencer strategy shouldn't be, oh, how do we make this small payment here, or, engage one time with somebody. It should be, how do we keep this person involved in the fold for the next 4 or 5 years? How do we keep giving them the right relationship? How do we make sure that we get them this client, right? How do we make sure that they make 250K a year off of us, not 25K, and that number varies depending on your level of influence and who you are and what you're doing. But generally speaking, you're trying to maximize that. And I think that was something that early on, and even now, isn't generally the norm, right? We still view the influencer from a company standpoint as the necessary ad spend 3 or 4 times a year when we have a product rollout, when we have a big conference, when we have those types of things. And so as again, back to my overall PR strategy of always kind of getting in and understanding both sides, what I started to realize was, okay, the key to this is just like you would be looking at talent attraction retention, right? You don't want to keep turning things over. You don't want to have to keep teaching people how to understand your brand. There's value in retaining that employee for 5 to 10 years. There's value in retaining that influencer for 5 to 10 years. And so by just slightly shifting the paradigm. Now, interesting thing too is if you pitch this into your company will actually like this because you will save your company money on overall spend on influencer. And now if you're an influencer watching this, you might be going, Jeff, F off. But I'm very mindful of that too, and always want to make sure that, there are still paid opportunities, there's still all those, but I want to make sure you're slotted into the best possible position as well. Because again, I wouldn't try and create something that I wouldn't take myself. And so that's always the thought process of building leverage, understanding the motivation of the people you're working with, and seeing if you can't find a little more less obvious but more advantageous way of working together. And so, as these processes have gone forward, it's worked. Now, it varies, and it a little bit becomes, contingent on how hard that influencer in that program works. I mean, these influencer programs can be 50 to 100 to 200 people. And how you create them, and then you kind of create what is essentially a little bit of a free market, but you're working individually with each one of them. And I stand by this philosophy for any company, whether you're selling a widget, your SaaS, your B2B, you're going to need to get awareness out there. And the other prong of this strategy is the PR side of it. Now, sometimes we separate social and PR. And social, now that we've gotten 15, 20 years into the life cycle, has a lot of different disciplines, right? We'll talk about ad spend, and it's becoming increasingly more a pay-to-play type of business. And that will always be part of your strategy. The way I look at it is always organic and earned media, because that's what I work in. So when I look at creating a strategy, I always have two prongs to it. I have the social metric side, the part that you need to sell back to the CMO to make sure that you continue to do this, right? I titled this, more than hearts and likes, because I think there's more to it than just that raw social engagement. Not everything will be a direct one-to-one. It's not like we're, doing a podcast ad and we're saying, use code Barrett to save 20% on virtual Austin. But what we are doing is we can track enough, right? And we can show traction, we can show growth, we can show enough things that these processes go forward. But the more tangible side of it is on the PR side. So if you can couple this influencer engagement with specific contributors and people who are at certain publications, right? This has been always the second bigger prong of what I do, is making sure inside of this influencer network, there's somebody at Forbes and Business Insider and Wall Street Journal and New York Times and everywhere else, right? So it's not just an influencer function, but it's getting everybody into this network and this loop, so that we not only reach our social goals, but we reach our PR goals. Because on the PR side of things, again, 98% of it is relationships. And on the back end, there's a lot of really talented people, begging, borrowing, and stealing, and trying to get that person who doesn't really have a stake in it to write about it. So if you give people who are writing a better reason to engage, more amplification, thinking about the things they might need, right? More amplification on what they're writing, increased opportunities for speaking, the ability to, get a book deal, the ability to network with whoever they need to network. That will vary, that will change for whoever it is. But again, it's understanding the behind the scenes motivation of anybody who has influence or is influential in your field. And so as you put together that network, keep thinking in mind of two things. How can I own the social conversation, and how can I generate coverage? And the more consistent you are with both will allow you two things. It will allow you to stress less about how you deal with turnover and how you ramp down and ramp back up, because this again becomes a more continuous process. And you might say, well, that's more involved. That process, Jeff, is more involved than just kind of sending out a release or sending a message to some influencers. And I would say yes and no, because in my strategy, you're not doing a release. You're not sending things out. You're taking all that effort right now that you spend on perfectly crafting the right message, and you're reallocating that to time spent, developing the perfect relationship, right? And then, yes, you will make sure that the messaging aligns and everything fits, but I think it's a more advantageous way to interact. That's in a nutshell of how you would do strategy from a big or mid-sized business. Now, from a smaller business standpoint, I think we always get bogged down a little bit in, and I've worked with a few small businesses, you can get bogged down pretty easily in, well, how do we gain a following? How do we start from zero? How do we get from 0 to 100 to 1,000? One of the things I think should always be thought of on the social side is you're going to have local micro influencers. You're going to have local conversations you can get into. But I've always looked at it this way. Whether or not I gain 1 million followers, or I find 10 people with 100,000 or 100,000 people with 10,000, it's all the same thing. You're all getting to the same level. And yes, you would love to have that in-house ideally, but you'll get there eventually. It's really just figuring out how can you engage enough people to care about your small brand to the point where you'll get consistent engagement. and amplification on what you're trying to get out there. You know, I don't deal in the paid side of things or the targeting side of things, but on the small business side, I strongly advise it, recommend it, think it's super vital because, you know, when you're dealing with lower awareness, that's something that you're going to want to tap into. And there's a lot of different ways you can do it. I'm not the person for it. That might be my, my best piece of professional advice. If you're one of the people on here who's growing something on your own, be able to say no. Say no more than you say yes. When I first started this, I said no 75% of the time because either the project didn't make sense or I didn't think I could deliver exactly right on that. The funny thing is I'm much better at national media than I am local media. So if anybody reached out to me locally in Grand Rapids, where I'm at and quarantined, I'd say, you know what, this isn't for me. You'd be better off with somebody else. That does two things. One, it makes sure that you deliver, that you grow, but it also allows you to create a bigger network, right? So then if you farm that out to somebody that can handle it, they might need you for something else. There's really a through line in everything I think about, whether it's social, whether it's PR, whether it's growing a business, and that's trying to be as valuable to as many people as possible, because that creates leverage, which again is my favorite word of the day, but it also diversifies all of your sales streams, revenue streams, how you can, you know, increase your business, and grow. I've been able to grow without hiring a sales team because I've just got a lot of good relationships that are built over time, and that's still in and of itself a sales effort. But if we get back into navigating social right now, the platforms, one of the interesting things I've always noticed about creators, right? So if your strategy is built, right, not on you building a network, right, small business, medium-sized big business, but if it's built more so on you, you know, finding the right people, and engaging with the right people. Creators have gone from, and I've done this too, I started in MySpace, but creators have gone from MySpace to Facebook to Twitter to Instagram to Vine to Snapchat to TikTok. Look at the platforms and you'll see that anybody who's a good creator has just figured out a way to do the same cross platforms. Very rarely do I see somebody who was great on Vine not be able to be great on Snapchat and TikTok. So as you keep these relationships, these people are just going to naturally flock to the platforms that make the most sense. You know, my friend David Rhodes in Canada has always been really good at that. Not sure when I get to see him next, but shout out to Rhodes. You know, I think my main takeaways, just as kind of like a halfway mark here, since we're 15 minutes in, are build leverage, try and diversify that leverage for your business or your career, because, you know, I'm really content where I am and with what I'm doing. Not just because I can afford suits that make me look like, again, a Miami used car salesman, but because I feel like I've done enough things and created enough leverage that if anything went south or my entire business fell apart, I'd always still have the audience, and the audience will always create value, and I'd figure out how to leverage that. And I probably never leverage that in the sense of, hey, you know, use code Barrett to save 20% on this. But I use that leverage to make sure that I'm valuable to the clients that I would want or the people that I want to work with. And that, I think, is the more behind the scenes thing that we never really talk that much on the influencer side about. We always talk about it more of as a direct relationship, right? So you're like, oh, I need some influencers to go out there and, you know, talk about this program we're doing, or I need to pay them, you know, $100 to go, you know, create a TikTok dance, which is way cheap. Nobody's going to do it for that money. But what I think we should be looking at more in this social space is, how do we merge communications and social more? And we've done this, and every comms agency has a social wing, but how do we really understand that function, those two functions, really exist to support the other one? Because I just find it incredibly hilarious that it's 2020 and we're still sending mass emails out to people. And I get about 100 a day, and they're sweet and they're wonderful. And the Midwesterner in me with these kind eyes probably responds to at least 5 of them a day, just to be like, hey, it's not something I'm interested in, but if you have something that does this, or let's build a relationship, right? But I think wholesale changes need to be made on that comm side of social and PR, where we're focusing more on building out the network, just like we would in social, and building out guaranteed coverage, or at least close to that, right? No, there are no absolute guarantees. If anything, the last month has taught any of us, there are no guarantees. Diversify your bonds, and try and make sure that, I think all businesses are going to want to figure out more and more ways to work from home. I mean, it's what, Wednesday, March 18th. There are still businesses I know that are agencies with like 45 people, having people come in, work at their desks, congregate. Why? We don't need that. I mean, I am perfectly able to do this all via teleconference. All of us right now are in different locations. We're getting information. Could be good, could be bad, could be useful. If not, again, just look at the alpacas. But I think from a business standpoint, we're going to need to look at how we can be more flexible, right? How we can have more work from home, how we can, be our most productive, right? I come from a generation where, we don't necessarily all have a home office. We just kind of work from one thing to another. I mean, I can look at Eric Hulkren's home office and be jealous AF, and I am, and I want that. I need to like go on a serious Funko binge too, but that will happen. That will happen in quarantine. But not only do we need to diversify, our thinking and how we do work from home, you tie it back into how we look at social, how we look at platforms. I think we need to diversify how many people we work with, right? I think that a lot of times the strategy in engaging with influencers is we might engage with 3 or 4 or 5. And I wouldn't say go out there and engage with 2,000, because that's nuts. And that will become a little bit more of a headache than you want it to. Although there are good companies that kind of do that sort, you're going to lose some touch with it. I think it's more important that you absolutely work directly with your influencers and who you can work with. But this should be tied between your social team and your comms team should be absolutely working in concert with each other. Now, if you're a small enough business and you're both of them, great. That's going to be super easy for you. But if you're not, having a conversation with your PR team, if you're on the social side, you should go like this. You should be like, where are your pain points? Where are your struggles? What outlets are you having a hard time finding? How do we engage better with those places, right? Who are your contacts? Okay, well, our organization could probably do the following things to be helpful to those people in media that we need. And so how do we link this up better? Obviously in an ethical way too, but how do we link these two things together so that we're providing value, creating leverage, and they're providing value in a more consistent way? That's probably my biggest thought at all times. There's the blocking and the tackling and the execution. And sometimes I do work like a conventional PR person. Sometimes I'm bugging somebody at CNBC. But generally speaking, I know what 95% of my stuff is doing, what day it's coming out, and why, because I have a network of people that I love and I trust, and I've built over time because there's been reciprocal value. And, it's never one-to-one. Things might, never work out completely right. But as long as you are making the attempt and people know that you're working for them, it tends to work out. I'll wrap up in about 2 minutes because I know we'll have a little block for questions and I want to be mindful of time. So I'll wrap on this. I think look at social less as an ad buy and more of a tool you can use both in front of the scenes and behind the scenes to kind of create leverage for your organization. That's pretty much a universal takeaway that will span in individual business, everything else. On the individual level, think about building up your social as much as you can, because you just don't know where the world's going, what's changing, and the bigger audience you can create and have will make you a little bit more recession proof in the future.